London, the Ivy Café. Mark Thompson, 28 years old, waiter with a stutter that has tormented him since forever, was about to serve a simple cappuccino when his life changed forever. The elegant woman at table 7 looked into his eyes while he stuttered apologies for the delay. At that moment, something clicked in her gaze, her eyes fixed on the scar on Mark's left hand. The woman suddenly turned pale. "It's you! It's really you! I am your mother!" The cup fell from Mark's trembling hands, shattering on the floor, along with 28 years of unanswered questions. But what he will discover about the truth of his abandonment will shock him beyond all imagination. Mark Thompson had learned to live with the forced silence of his stutter. At 28, he had been working for 5 years at the prestigious Ivy Café in the heart of London, where well-off customers often showed impatience when he struggled to take orders. Every morning he looked at himself in the mirror repeating the same phrases, hoping that day the words would come out more fluently. His story began in emptiness. Raised at St. Margaret's Orphanage until 18, the only thing he knew was that he had been found in a cardboard box outside a church door. He had only a blue blanket and a strange scar on his left hand that doctors couldn't explain. That November morning, the cafe was particularly busy. Businessmen read newspapers, tourists photographed the famous counter, coffee and warm scone aromas mixed in the air. Mark moved between tables with his usual silent grace, communicating more through gestures than words. At table 7 sat a woman who immediately caught his attention. Elegant, around 50, dressed in a gray suit that spoke of discreet wealth. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, but her green eyes betrayed a deep unease, as if she were searching for something lost long ago. Mark approached with his order pad, heart beginning to beat faster. The presence of this refined woman made him nervous. The woman ordered a cappuccino with a strangely hoarse voice. When their eyes met, Mark saw something strange in her expression. A flash of recognition, of shock, something he couldn't decipher. Mark moved away towards the counter, feeling the woman's gaze following him. While preparing the order, his hands trembled slightly. There was something about this customer that troubled him, an inexplicable sense of familiarity. When he returned to the table with the cappuccino, his hands trembled even more. Attempting to place the cup, it slipped in the saucer, producing a clink that in the silence of the moment seemed deafening. Mark stuttered apologies for his nervousness, his face reddening with embarrassment. Then, the unthinkable happened. The woman, who was bringing the cup to her lips, stopped dead. Her eyes had fixed on Mark's left hand, the one with the scar protruding from his shirt sleeve. The woman stared at that scar with an intensity that made Mark uncomfortable. Her hands began to tremble, and the cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor in 1,000 pieces. Mark instinctively hid his hand behind his back, a gesture he made as a child when orphanage mates mocked him. He explained it was just an old accident, but the woman wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes were fixed on his face, studying every feature with growing intensity. Suddenly, she stood up abruptly from her chair. Her trembling voice broke the silence. She asked Mark how old he was. 28, he replied, completely confused by the woman's reaction. The questions continued with surgical precision. Birth date, March 15, 1995. Place, St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The abandonment. Each of Mark's answers seemed to confirm something the woman already knew. The words hit him like punches to the stomach. The cafe around them seemed to have disappeared, sounds muffled, as if they had fallen into an unreal bubble of silence. When Mark asked who she was, the woman looked at him with eyes that now glistened with unshed tears. Her lips trembled as she tried to find the words she had attempted to say for 28 years. "I'm Helen Whitmore, and you are my son." Mark felt his legs give way beneath him. He gripped the table to keep from falling, while the world around seemed to spin like a mad carousel. Other cafe customers were watching them curiously, but he didn't even notice. Helen explained through tears now flowing freely down her face. She had recognized that scar immediately. It was caused by an umbilical cord malformation, and those green eyes were identical to her father's. The cafe manager approached with concern. Mark asked for a break, and Mr. Davies, respecting his most reliable waiter's privacy, agreed. Helen gathered her handbag with trembling hands and suggested talking elsewhere. Mark, his heart beating so hard it hurt his chest, agreed to go to Hyde Park. They walked silently through London streets, Mark ahead, and Helen a few steps behind, as if she feared he might disappear. They reached an isolated bench in the park and sat with 28 years of separation distance between them. Mark's first word was what Helen expected and dreaded. Why? Helen closed her eyes as if that question were physical pain. She began telling her story. She was 19 when she became pregnant. Her parents, wealthy and respectable, sent her away to a convent in Yorkshire to hide the shame. They told her if she kept the baby, they would cut her off from the family forever. Mark listened without speaking, hands clenched into fists. When he accused Helen of throwing him away, she turned to him with eyes full of desperation. Helen told how she had tried to keep him. For 3 days, she had him with her, nursed him, watched him sleep. She had fallen in love with him from the first moment. But on the 4th day, her father arrived with 2 men who tore Mark away while he slept. They told her they would take him somewhere safe, where he would have a family that loved him. Helen fainted from pain. The most shocking revelation came after. When Helen woke up, they told her Mark had died, that there had been a complication. For years, she believed her son had died because of her. Mark stood up from the bench, pacing back and forth. 3 years ago, after Helen's father's death, she had found documents in his safe, forged death certificates for Mark, payments to unknown people. She understood she had been lied to and hired a private investigator. The search had lasted 3 years. London was vast. Helen only had the orphanage name. She had visited hundreds of places, shown photos to thousands of people. The investigator found a photo of 16-year-old Mark on the orphanage website, with the scar clearly visible. From there, they could trace his movements to the cafe. Mark asked why she hadn't sent the investigator to talk to him. Helen replied she had lost 28 years of her life and didn't want to lose another second. The days that followed were the most confused of Mark's life. Helen had left him her phone number and an avalanche of conflicting emotions he didn't know how to handle. He returned to work at the Ivy Café, but couldn't concentrate. The stutter, instead of improving with the revelation of his origins, seemed worsened by the emotional weight of the discovery. For 3 days, he didn't call Helen, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say to her. What do you say to a mother who has searched for you for 28 years? It was Helen who called him on the 4th evening. Her voice on the phone was different from in person, more fragile, more uncertain. She asked if he wanted to have dinner together without rushing when he felt ready. Mark looked at his empty bedsit in Camden. White walls, single bed, nearly empty fridge. A life built with bare necessities, without roots, without history. He agreed for the next day. Rule's restaurant was a family place Mark had chosen because he knew the owner and the intimate atmosphere made him feel less exposed. Helen arrived punctually, dressed in a navy blue dress that made her look younger. She carried a leather bag that seemed to cost more than Mark's monthly salary. During dinner, Helen told about her life. After what happened with Mark, she could never have children again. She had married David, a fellow barrister, 10 years earlier. He was a good man who knew about Mark and the search. Mark discovered Helen had become a successful solicitor. She had a normal life, a career, a husband. It was almost disappointing after imagining for years who his mother might be. Helen confessed there wasn't a day she hadn't thought of him. Not a birthday she hadn't imagined how he would have been. She had a box at home full of gifts she would have given him each year if he had been with her. 28 gifts, one for each lost year. Mark asked the question that tormented him: why she had never defied her father, why she had never said no. Helen explained she was 19, alone, frightened, economically dependent on them, and she truly believed Mark was dead. When Mark asked what she wanted from him now, Helen replied she just wanted to know him, to know who he had become, what he liked, what frightened him. She wanted to make up for lost time, if he would let her. Mark asked what would happen if he wasn't the person she expected. Helen smiled for the first time that evening, saying she had loved him before seeing him, and would love him whatever person he had become. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Helen began building a relationship that had neither name nor precedent. They weren't mother and son in the traditional sense. Too many years had passed, but neither were they simple acquaintances. They were two strangers bound by blood trying to find balance. Helen often came to the Ivy Café, not always to talk with Mark, but just to see him work, observe his gestures, visually catch up on lost years. Mr. Davies had noticed the presence of this elegant lady who always ordered a cappuccino and watched Mark with affectionate eyes. The manager asked Mark if she was his mother. Mark nodded, still not used to pronouncing that word. Mother. It seemed strange after 28 years when it had been just a fantasy. One evening, Helen invited him to her home. She lived in an elegant flat in Kensington with David, a distinguished man in his 60s, who welcomed Mark with genuine warmth. The house was full of books, paintings, objects that told of a fulfilled life. But what struck Mark was a room Helen showed him with obvious embarrassment. A room furnished like a child's bedroom, with single bed.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Shelves full of books for all ages, never opened toys. On the walls were photos of Mark at various ages, collected from the orphanage. Helen explained she had prepared it when she bought this house 10 years earlier, hoping one day Mark would return. Mark entered the room, touching objects his mother had chosen for him. There were books of all kinds, toys ranging from childhood to adolescence, and in a corner, that box of gifts. Helen opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were 28 packages, each with a label indicating the age. Mark took the first birthday one, a brown teddy bear. The label said, "For my baby," on his first birthday. Mummy loves you even though she can't be with you. The tears Mark had held back for weeks finally came out. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something more complex. Gratitude, pain, love, anger, all mixed together. Helen hugged him for the first time, and Mark noticed she smelled of vanilla, the same scent he had always imagined a mother should have. That evening they dined together, David lightening the atmosphere with amusing stories, Helen filling Mark's plate as English mothers do. For the first time in his life, Mark felt part of a family. David asked about his stutter. Mark explained he had always had it, probably related to abandonment trauma. Helen offered to help with a specialist she knew. Mark hesitated, then accepted. Walking home that evening, Mark realized that for the first time he could remember, he didn't feel alone. He had a mother who loved him, a stepfather who accepted him, a home where he was welcome. But above all, he had hope that his life could truly change. Therapy with Dr. Williams began 3 weeks later. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a calm voice. Her practice was in Harley Street, in a building where London's bustle seemed muffled. The doctor explained that stuttering was often not just a physical problem, but could be linked to emotional trauma, anxiety, feelings of inadequacy. The fact that Mark had found his mother could be the key to unlocking many things. The sessions were intense. The doctor helped him relax muscles, breathe correctly, but above all encouraged him to talk about his emotions without fear of judgment. Mark told how he had always stuttered since arriving at the orphanage, how it made him feel different, wrong, as if his voice wasn't worth as much as others. Now that he knew the truth about his history, he felt angry, sad, but also relieved. Finally, he knew why he was there. The doctor explained it was normal to feel all these emotions together. His body had held this trauma for 28 years. Now that the truth had come out, his voice could also begin to free itself. Slowly, Mark began noticing improvements. During conversations with Helen and David, the stutter became less intense. At work, he managed to take orders with greater fluency. Mr. Davies noticed immediately. Mark was speaking better. Having his mother in his life was good for him. Helen often accompanied him to sessions, waiting in the waiting room as real mothers do. Sometimes they walked after therapy, talking about everything and nothing, catching up on conversations they had never had. Helen asked what he remembered about the orphanage. Mark told about Sister Margaret, kind but with 40 children to care for. Father Patrick, who taught reading and writing. Thomas, 2 years older, who protected him from bullies. Sarah, a girl who always cried, to whom he sang lullabies heard on television. Helen smiled, saying he had always had a generous heart. Mark replied that at the orphanage he had no choice. You had to take care of others, because no one else would. Helen reassured him. It wasn't like that anymore. Now he had her. A month after starting therapy, Mark did something he had never dared. He applied for a better job. Helen had seen an advertisement for a receptionist at a luxury hotel near Piccadilly Circus. Mark was terrified. He had to talk all day. With his stutter, he would never manage. Helen encouraged him. He was improving every day. And what was the worst that could happen? The interview was terrifying, but Mark managed to answer using techniques learned from Dr. Williams. The words came out more fluently than expected. Not perfect, but understandable. 2 days later, he received the call. He had got the job. Mark began crying with pure joy. For the first time in his life, someone had chosen him, seeing beyond his stutter. He immediately called Helen to give her the news. For the first time, he used that word, "Mom, I got a job." On the other end of the phone, Helen burst into tears too, saying how proud she was of her child. 2 years after that chance encounter at the Ivy Café, Mark's life was completely transformed. He worked at the Savoy as head receptionist. His stutter had become a slight stumble that only manifested in moments of great stress, and above all, he had a family. Helen and David had become the parents he never had. They hadn't managed to recover the 28 lost years, but they were building something new and precious every day. Mark dined at their place at least 3 times a week, spent weekends there, even had a key to their flat. The room Helen had prepared for him had truly become his room. He didn't sleep there often, preferring his independence in the Camden bedsit, but knowing there was a place where he was always welcome had filled a void he had carried within since forever. He had also started a relationship with Emma, a hotel colleague. She was a girl from Manchester, sweet and patient, who had never made problems about his stutter. She liked how he spoke. Each word seemed more important, more thoughtful. That March evening, exactly 2 years after their first meeting, Helen had organized a special dinner. She had invited Mark, Emma, David, and even some orphanage friends Mark had managed to find. Helen had explained it was an anniversary, the day they found their family. The table was set with the best china, flowers everywhere. Helen had cooked all Mark's favorite dishes she had discovered in 2 years. During dinner, David stood for a toast. 2 years ago, Helen was a woman broken by remorse and pain. Mark was a lonely young man who believed he wasn't worth enough to be loved. Now, looking at them, he saw a real family, built not on blood or convention, but on love and forgiveness. Helen wiped her eyes, saying these 2 years had been the most beautiful of her life, not only because she had found Mark, but because she had learned that a mother's love has no expiration date. No matter how many years pass, how much ground there is to make up, love is always there. Mark stood up in turn. The stutter had completely disappeared, replaced by a confident and clear voice. 2 years ago, he thought his life was already written. destined to always remain what he was, an orphan with a stutter working in a cafe. They had taught him it's never too late to change one's own story. He addressed Helen directly, thanking her for never stopping looking for him, for transforming the most normal day of his life into the day that changed everything. After dinner, while guests chatted, Mark and Helen went out on the terrace to look at illuminated London. Mark asked if she had any regrets. Helen had only one, not having had the courage to rebel against her father when she was 19. But then she thought maybe things had to happen that way. Maybe they had to wait to be ready, both of them, to be a family. Mark asked if she believed in destiny. Helen replied that now, yes, she believed some people were destined to find each other, sooner or later. Mark looked at the city spreading below them. Tomorrow he would return to the Ivy Café to greet Mr. Davies and introduce him to Emma. Helen commented she was a good girl. She could see how she looked at him. Mark asked how. Helen replied she looked at him like she had looked at him that first day, as if he were a miracle. Mark smiled, saying maybe they all were, in their own way. Helen confirmed he certainly was, her miracle. They remained silent, watching stars that timidly appeared in London's sky. Two people who had been lost for 28 years and had discovered that love knows how to wait, how to forgive, how to begin again. The next day, Mark indeed returned to the Ivy Café. Mr. Prentice Davies welcomed him with his usual smile, asking how work at the hotel was going. Mark thanked him, explaining that if he hadn't hired a stuttering waiter, he would never have met his mother. Mr. Davies laughed, saying, "Destiny always finds its way." And besides, Mark wasn't just a stuttering waiter. He was the kindest waiter he had ever had. Mark looked around the cafe where he had worked for 5 years. Table 7, where Helen had sat that day, was occupied by tourists. Who knows how many other stories had crossed in that place? How many destinies had intertwined over a simple cappuccino? Leaving the cafe, Mark felt completely at peace with himself. He had a family, a job he loved, a girlfriend who made him feel special. His stutter hadn't completely disappeared, but it was no longer an obstacle. It was simply part of him, of his story, of the path that had led him to become the man he was. And above all, he knew he was no longer alone. He had a mother who loved him, who had always loved him, even when she believed he was dead. He had learned that a mother's love is the most powerful force in the world, capable of overcoming time, distance, and even the impossible. That evening, while dining with Emma at a small pub in Camden, Mark told her about that special day. Didn't she find it incredible? If that day he hadn't stuttered so much, if he hadn't dropped that cup, maybe his mother wouldn't have recognized him. Emma smiled, saying maybe his stutter wasn't a defect. Maybe it was the way destiny was preparing him for that moment. Mark asked if she really believed everything had meaning. Emma replied he was living proof that every story, even the most difficult, could have a happy ending. That night, for the first time in his life, Mark fell asleep with the certainty of being exactly where he should be, with the people he should love, living the life he had always deserved to live. The stutter that for years had been his cross had become the key that opened the door to his happiness. And this, he thought as he closed his eyes, was the greatest miracle of all. If this story has touched your heart, leave a like, share in the comments. Do you believe miracles really exist? Have you experienced a moment that completely changed your life? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more true stories that prove love always wins. Remember, sometimes what we consider a defect is actually our hidden superpower.